Okay, good morning, everyone. That was certainly a wonderful way to start out our day. Thank you very much, Dolores, for those words. I think they're going to be very helpful in guiding people for the work that we have to do today. So thank you very much again. Okay, so now we get to get into funding as a topic of discussion for today. Oh, I need the flipper. My batteries are dead here. Not my batteries, but batteries in the clicker. So just bear with me for now. So if you can move it to the first slide. Okay, so again, we'll start out with what it is that we've heard regarding funding for First Nations education over the course of the charting, this part of the Charting Our Own Path Forward initiative. So Focus Group 2013, funds should flow directly from Treasury Board to First Nations. And like I said the other day, this is something that hasn't changed all along the initiative. We have heard consistently that First Nations want funding to flow directly from Treasury Board and not through Indian Affairs. One of the key questions that came out of one of the first focus group sessions was how do we ensure that organizations that exist are not jeopardized by the development of a collective education support organization. So that's that third support circle that we were talking about. And I think that this probably came up in some of your conversations you had about the third support circle yesterday. So I just wanted to acknowledge that all along, there's certainly been questions about how we do develop that third support circle and not jeopardize any of the current existing organizations. So it's something that we've tried to take into consideration as we're moving forward here. So at Symposium 2013, these are some of the comments that we heard. Transfer payment from feds comes with jurisdiction. It provides much more control over funding and an education system. And we have to break the colonial mentality and be involved outside the box. So that's something that's very difficult. And I can, have perfect understanding of how we have trouble thinking outside of the box and thinking outside of where we are today and what we have to deal with today. To be able to put on those blinders like I was talking about earlier and just think about what it is that we want for First Nations education, not how we move from where we are today necessarily, but what is it that we want? Because we are working in a colonial system. And it's a challenge to think outside of that system, outside of the box where we receive funding for education in various ways that we're going to talk about. How is it that we could see it in a different way that would improve our improve the support that we provide to our students and our learners. Another comment is that Indian Affairs should be totally eliminated. Why should the dollars go through them? And I would also add to this, why should the dollars go to them? Because they do absorb a certain amount of the funding that flows through, before it flows through to First Nations. Focus groups in 2014, we did talk about the Collective First Nation Education Organization. And a comment was receive and disperse transfer funding from the Treasury Board. So once again, this was a common theme. Jurisdiction over education means being able to direct how we utilize our resources. So, it's part of our jurisdiction over education, it's part of our First Nation control of our own education system, is being able to say how those dollars should flow and how those dollars are utilized, and not having to follow predetermined processes and ways of utilizing that funding. So at the Gateway to Freedom Education Summit in May of 2014, what was part of the vision that was created at that particular meeting was Canada and First Nations will negotiate to reach agreement on a new fiscal framework and relationship for our education systems, in which Canada provides fiscal transfer payments that are needs-based, equitable, stable, predictable, and meet the First Nations student education outcomes no less successful than those of the non-First Nation students, and that those transfer payments would cover capital costs for First Nation schools and other educational facilities. At the education officer gatherings in 2014, some of the questions that were brought up or were raised at those sessions is, how is the overall amount determined for the federal transfer? So that federal transfer that we're asking for from the Treasury Board, how is that amount determined? And a lot of the conversations have revolved around the fact that it has to be a comprehensive funding formula that determines the overall amount. Who makes up the regional support partnership? And that's the terminology that was used there, so that's the terminology that I used in the slide. But really what we're talking about there is what has evolved into the third support circle. So who makes up the regional support, or the third support circle? Now, that was one of the questions that came up yesterday when we were reviewing the comments on the third support circle. And really, that's what we need to determine. That's what you need to help us determine. I mean, it's been suggested that we need a third support circle, but we need you to tell us who that third support circle is. Who does it make sense for that to make up that third support circle? It certainly isn't the Chiefs of Ontario, because the Chiefs of Ontario is not a service delivery organization. The role of Chiefs of Ontario is to coordinate and advocate on behalf of the First Nation communities, the 133 First Nation communities in Ontario. It's not the role of the Chiefs of Ontario to deliver services to the First Nations. So that third support circle would have to be something outside of the Chiefs of Ontario. Chiefs of Ontario would still play that coordination and advocacy role, but certainly the third, there's been no indication that people want the Chiefs of Ontario to play that role. And so that's what we need to hear from you, is who would play that role? Do we need to have a new body established, or is there existing bodies that you think could take on that role? The other question that came through the education officer gatherings is, who creates the formula for distribution to First Nations? Well, it's us. It's us who create the formula. No one else is going to create the formula for us, because nobody else knows what's needed, right? So when we're asking questions, who's going to do this, who's going to do that, who's going to do this, we have to do this. We have to do it for ourselves. No one else, well, I say no one else is going to do it for us. No one else is going to do it for us the way we want it to happen. So we have to do this work. It has to come from us. Some other comments that we heard from the education officer gatherings are that the treaty relationship must be retained, funds must be flowed to First Nations first, and then to a third support circle. So that the funds need to flow directly to the First Nation and then to a third support circle. But as you'll notice in the document that you were given, there are some other considerations, because that wasn't that was brought up throughout the various discussions and conversations that we've had. Someone liked the idea of not losing funding to Indian Affairs, and that's what we talked about, is a direct flow from Treasury Board, so that I think it's upwards of 30% of the funding that doesn't get captured in the bureaucracy of Indian Affairs. The idea of a treaty-based system was brought forward as an option for consideration. So once again, treaty-based system is this is where we heard it. We heard it in several of the meetings, and that's why that's one of the options. So the charting our own path forward document, I know you've seen this slide several times, but I just wanted to bring everyone back to the fact that the document is an evergreen living document. It's something that is going to change as we move forward. When we start working on Monday, when we get back to the office, that document is going to change based on the input that you've provided today. So it embraces the spirit of unity. It's something that we're doing together, and it's visionary, and there's going to be an organic evolution of that document. It synthesizes and collects all of the input to date, and what the input to date has been what's developed, those support circles, those 3 support circles. If we take all of the information back to the office and start looking at it, and there is only 2 support circles, or there's 5 support circles, whatever it turns out to be is what it's going to be, right? It's all going to be based on the input that's provided. Ideas and options on systems and funding, utilizing the support circle framework lens, is what is in the current document, which may stay the same and it may change. So what is the current reality for First Nations funding? Getting into the nitty-gritty of the funding. Well, these are the sources of lifelong learning funding. And it's not a comprehensive listing. Certainly there are other areas that we do pull funding from. But this gives you an idea of all of the different areas that we source funding to source the education of our learners. When we're looking at early learning, we get funding through Health Canada, Aboriginal Head Start, parental nutrition, FASD funding, maternal child, children's oral health. These are all different programs that are offered through Health Canada, and they're all accessed in different ways. Some are accessed by everyone, some are proposal-based. And then for early learning, we get funding through Indian Affairs as well. We have child daycare and the National Child Benefit Reinvestment Fund, Employment and Social Development, First Nation Inuit Child Care. And then from the province, we access funding for early learning through Aboriginal Healthy Babies and Healthy Children, and Aboriginal FASD and child nutrition. Now, like I said, this is not a comprehensive list, but these are the main sources of funding that we utilize. So at the community level, when we're looking at developing an early learning strategy at the community level, this is what needs to be coordinated right now. Each community has to look at all of these different areas, and they have to work with their health people, they have to work with their education people, you have to work with your social services people. If you wanted to develop an early learning strategy at the community level, everyone needs to be involved in it, because there's so many different areas that you draw funding from, right? You know, is that happening? I'm not sure. Are things still happening in silos? I think so. So this is one of the reasons why we need to coordinate. We need to be able to connect the dots to build something that is more cohesive, so everyone doesn't have to reinvent the wheel at the community level. When we're looking at K-12 funding, we have, from Indian Affairs, we get the band operated funding formula, which we know is totally inadequate We're not talking about the adequacy of funding right now, we're just kind of talking about where it comes from. But we get funding through the band operated funding formula. We get funding through the high cost special education program. We get funding through NUPAS, Education Partnerships Program, which the SR there refers to structural readiness, because there's structural readiness dollars in the Education Partnerships Program. The First Nations Student Success Program also has structural readiness dollars in that particular program. Cultural education centers. These are the various programs that have to be accessed by each First Nation community to be able to provide. Well, some of them, I guess, are aggregates. EPP and FNSSP are generally through groups of First Nations that are accessing that funding. But really, there are several groups that are accessing that funding. Nothing is coordinated up on an Ontario-wide basis where everybody's sharing information. Then from Ontario perspective, funding for First Nation students in the provincial system comes through the First Nation Maintained Inuit Education Supplement in the Grants for Student Needs, which is the provincial funding formula that is used to fund education in the provincial system. There's EPO funding, which is kind of other designated funding that is available through the province, and that funding, both the FNMI supplement and the EPO funding supply funding to provincial school boards for First Nation Maintained Inuit education. Unfortunately, they're not enveloped right now, so that means there's nothing really saying that that's what the funding has to be used for. But the funding is provided to school boards. There are reverse tuition agreements. We heard that. We heard some of the panel yesterday talking about reverse tuition agreements as a source of funding for First Nations education. Although we do have difficulties in a lot of areas in actually getting those reverse tuition agreements in place, because it is up to each individual school board whether they want to provide one of those reverse tuition or engage in one of those reverse tuition agreements. When we're looking at post-secondary education funding, funding that is accessed through Indian Affairs, through the post-secondary education program. There's 3 components of that. The largest component by far out of the post-secondary education program is the post-secondary student support program. And that is what's used to fund our students that are going to colleges and universities for post-secondary education. And we know that funding is woefully inadequate as well. All of the funding in all of these areas, I don't think that anybody would argue that it's adequate or sufficient. For post-secondary education, funding is also accessed through, is accessed through the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities, and it's the Post-Secondary Education Fund for Aboriginal Learners, or also known as PFAL. So that's the funding that is utilized to support our Aboriginal institutes of higher learning in Ontario, and also some of that funding goes to mainstream colleges and universities to fund Aboriginal programming within those institutions. So those are the various sources of funding for First Nations education. So I think that it's kind of easy to see that if we were able to develop some kind of comprehensive funding formula, we would do away with having to put in a proposal for this, put in a proposal for that, put in a proposal for this, put in a proposal for that, report on this, report on that, report on this, report on that, right? So that's basically what this slide is about, just showing that there's so many just different sources of funding, and what can we do to streamline things. funding flow, when we're talking about the flow of funding from these various sources of funding, it flows in various ways to First Nation communities and First Nation organizations such as tribal councils and PTOs. So mostly in the provincial, for the provincial funding, it flows through a TPA. I'm trying to think what the acronym means now. Yes, there we go, Transportation Agreement through the provincial ministries. And mostly through the, mostly through the federal ministries, it's a comprehensive funding agreement at the community level. But there also are those other organizations that do receive funding. And then they come through grants, set contributions, fixed contributions, flexible contributions, and block contributions. And they all have different parameters around what the funding can be used for, and if the funding can be used, if the funding can be retained to be utilized in subsequent years or anything like that. So there's all kinds of, I keep on pushing the wrong button, sorry. There's all kinds of different guidelines that are associated with these. It's very complex. So then when we go back to our chart here about how we're kind of organized today, it's kind of easy to see how, this, maybe these over here access the same funding that are being accessed by this, and perhaps at the community level, PTO level, the tribal council level. Everybody's accessing those same pots of funding, right? Everybody's putting in proposals for the same pots of funding, and it's a big competition, right? So this is one of the reasons why it's so important, and we've talked about this over the course of all of this this initiative, is we have to get out of this. We have to get out of this big competition for dollars for First Nations education. What happens is a lot of the proposal-based programs go to those who can make the good proposals, right? So it leaves communities with less capacity, organizations with maybe less capacity. How do they ever grow, right? How do they ever grow if they don't even have the capacity to put in a proposal that's going to get them the funding, right? So those kids, those students that are at the center of everything, those students are the ones that suffer, right? Because of the system. One of the other things that I'd like to point out here too is the fact that there's administrative dollars that go along with all of these programs when you access them. So when you have a tribal council accessing the funding, when you have a PTO accessing, when you have First Nations accessing the funding, everybody has administrative dollars that are set aside, and they don't flow to the student, right? If we add it up, and I have not done this exercise, but I think that it's actually an important exercise to do, but I'm not really sure if I even have the information to do it. But if we were able to add up all of those administrative dollars that for all of the proposal writing and all of the report writing and internal staff and things like that are all associated with all of this big competition for dollars, we would have lots more funding for our First Nation students. We would have excess funding that would be able to be utilized to support a third support organization. So that's the rationale for creating something that is much more streamlined and coordinated. So we have, this is the flow preference is the intergovernmental transfer via comprehensive funding formula, directly from Treasury Board to First Nations or a designated recipient. And those are the things that we have to decide. So if we're going to have funding flow, who is the designated recipient? Does it go to First Nations? Does it go to the second support circle? Does it go, like, how does it flow? Those are the questions that we need to be answered. So when we're looking at the funding flow, we have the Treasury Board, who has the dollars. I should have put a big dollar sign there. And we have the first support circle, we have the second support circle, and we have the third support circle. How does the funding flow? And that's the question that we're going to really discuss today as we move forward. So in your documents, you have several options that have been developed through conversations over time. And again, this is nothing that's set in stone. These are just ideas. They're options from all of the conversations that we've had so far. And what we want today is we want your input on these various options. Option one, I'm gonna need my glasses here. Option one, so you'll notice here that we have self-government agreements kind of in their own bubble here. And that is because when a self-government agreement is agreed upon between an entity and the Government of Canada, it automatically gets a flow directly from Treasury Board. Okay, so I put the self-government agreements out here so that we know that Anishinaabe Nation, Union of Ontario Indians, once their agreement is solidified, this is their flow. This is how it's going to flow. But for the rest of the First Nations in Ontario, so there's really, it's probably not 133 here, but just for illustration purposes, we'll put everybody in this pot right now, because as it stands right now, we don't have any self-government agreements. So the Treasury Board would flow funding to the third support circle, whatever that entity is that is developed by us. And then the third support circle will flow funding to the 133 First Nations via a comprehensive funding formula. And then either those 133 First Nations can flow funding out to the second support circle, or it could be agreed upon that funding is going to flow from the third support circle. So this is something that all has to be discussed, and so how would this happen, right? And in your Charting Your Own Path Forward document, there's advantages and disadvantages, or advantages and challenges associated with at each one of these options. Option two, this looks at flowing, and you'll always see the self-government agreements are here in their own bubble, because that's the way that Treasury Board will flow the dollars to those entities. And that's agreed upon within the agreement, how that funding flows. This option, Treasury Board flows funding to each First Nation individually. It also flows funding to the third support circle individually. And then for the second support circle, they either get funding directly from the third support circle, or the First Nations each provide funding to the second support circle. Hopefully this is understandable. I would say if you have any questions as I'm moving along, please ask them. Option three, this one talks about talks about flowing funding directly from Treasury Board to each of the 133 First Nations, and then and that's the only mechanism is from Treasury Board to the First Nation directly, and then of course the self-government agreements out here. but that's the only flow from Treasury Board is to each First Nation community through some kind of comprehensive funding formula. And then it would be up to individual First Nation communities to flow funding to the second support circle. And to, first of all, to flow funding to the third support circle, and then decide whether it's the third support circle that funds the second support circle, or if it's the 133 First Nations that flow funding, a portion of their funding for the second support circle. So this really puts the onus on the First Nations to decide if they want to support the third support circle and access the services of the third support circle, and if they want to support the second support circle and access the services of the second support circles. Option 4 is a treaty-based system, and for a treaty-based system, it could flow the same way as any of these, but this the third support circle would be the treaty-based system, or the treaty entity. So you could use any of the options, but the treaty organization or entity would be the third support circle. And of course, these are all just options. Option 5 takes a look at the possibility of creating a blended system like we were talking about yesterday, where the blended system has may have some communities set up through one type of system, some communities set up through a different type of system. So in this particular depiction that we have here, we have a PTO-based system over here. We have a geographic proximity system here in this kind of slice of the system. And then we have a treaty-based system set up here for treaty organizations that are taking on this role within the system. And then we have a tribal council-based system out here. So communities have decided that they want to go with the tribal council system, or they want to go with a treaty-based system, or geographic proximity, and then it's up to them. I know that people were getting a little bogged down with the layers in here, and perhaps we should have kept it a little cleaner, but try not to get bogged down with what's in here. What's in here is just a suggestion. You can put anything you want in these circles, anything, and that's the beauty of it. So, and this is, the thing is though, that no matter what we have in this second support circle, that we're all going to work together, regardless of whether you're in a self-government agreement, regardless of whether you're in a treaty-based system, regardless of whether you're one community on your own sole community. You know, those are all options. It's just what we're trying to get at here is the fact that we need to work together, right, in these various levels. So we would be working together in the second support circle and working together in the third support circle, and ensuring that there's communication going back and forth through the various circles that are going to support that First Nation student in a more comprehensive way than we're currently supporting them. So, we come to another discussion and input session. I know you're all excited about it. I just need to get my question.